My name is Daniela Gonzalez, and I'm the dairy management specialist for the Central New York Dairy, Livestock, and Field Crops team. And with that, I'm honored to present our speaker for today. So our speaker for today is Dr. Kaitlyn Briggs. Kaitlyn Briggs is a veterinarian on the Animal Welfare and Sustainability team at fairylife, where she supports on-farm continuous improvement projects and levels up the stories to corporate teams. Prior to joining fairylife, she worked in private practice in Michigan for Thumb Veterinary Services and on the environmental research team at Dairy Management Inc. From the National Dairy Checkoff. So with that, Kaitlyn, thank you so much for being here. And we are ready to start. So please start sharing whenever you want. Take it away.
Thanks. And while I know Daniela already introduced myself, I always find it a little helpful to tell you guys from my own perspective who I think I am. So like Daniela said, I'm Kaitlyn. I'm a veterinarian. I work on the animal welfare and sustainability team at fairylife. I also consider myself an exercise enthusiast. So you can find me hiking in the mountains, skiing in the mountains, attending any group fitness class. I hate working out on my own, but if any of you are group fitness junkies, I'll see you there. And then because of my husband's job, I find myself as a weekend fresh cow checker, the trailer loader, the pen mover, whatever sort of needed an extra body on the dairy on the weekends. I am a New York native. I grew up in Sherburne, New York, which is in Shenango County, for those of you that might know where that is on the map. And I actually currently live in the Yakima Valley. Mabton is our town, but in Washington. So I've completely changed coasts and am experiencing dry lot dairying for the first time now in real life. I want to start today with a set of definitions because I know longevity, productive life, these sorts of conversations can be things that we might not all be talking about the same thing. So first, what is longevity? Well, I'm going to break that into two categories, actually. Cow longevity, which is the productive life of an individual animal. So that would be how long does a cow last in the herd? Is she staying for one lactation, 2, 3, 4, however long that might be? Herd longevity is the average productive life of all of the animals within the herd. So this takes into account all of those animals that leave in their first lactation and those that might stay until their 8th, but it's the average across all of those. And then for productive life, sometimes we think about this being all the way from birth until exiting the herd, but really today we're going to focus on that lactation time. So I'm going to define this today as the total amount of time from first calving until a cow leaves the herd. So cow longevity is impacted by her individual health and performance. We take into account her health events, her milk production, her reproduction, and I think we can all agree that a cow whose cow card you see on the right here, who all she does is freshen. We notice some heats before the voluntary wait period. We breed her and then she's pregnant. Like that is the perfect cow. She doesn't have any health events. She's making good milk, which, well, because she's 310 days of milk, you can't see it on this one, but she made great milk. And she, in this case, she's a 5th lactation animal. So she clearly made that level in order to continue staying in the herd. Now, herd longevity is really driven by those herd level decisions that we make in young stock rearing, in breeding decisions, whatever those are. So this is truly impacted by how much sex semen we choose versus how much beef semen, whether or not we're still using conventional semen, because that's when we start that very first decision of how many heifers are we going to have hit the ground. Then how well heifers do in that rearing process, right? Are we at 2% calf mortality or are we at 5% calf mortality? Do we have a whole bunch of heifers that actually don't get pregnant and don't make it into the breeding, into the calving group or not? Those things are what impact, they can take into account this herd longevity piece. Of course, once you calve, we all know that individual cow longevity can impact this herd longevity piece too. And a piece that I really want to bring up front is this idea that average herd longevity is a push, not a pull decision. What I mean by that is that just a pull decision would be if a cow got mastitis or if she was lame, but like really lame again, and something that we didn't feel like we could keep on the herd. That's actually not going to cause a heifer to calve and her to leave the herd. We see those limping cows, we see cows with mastitis, we have more tolerance for those things if we don't have replacements entering our herd. So average herd longevity is truly a push decision. This means that as heifers enter the herd, or as we purchase more heifers, that allows us to make those decisions about cows who maybe we don't want to deal with a second case of mastitis, or we don't want to make her 3/4, or maybe we don't feel like having that lame cow on the herd anymore. We have that ability to make those decisions because heifers are joining the herd. Now, some of you might argue and say, well, all of those examples you gave were what we would consider involuntary culls. And I'd push back on that a little bit and say that we have more tolerance for what involuntary culls are, unless an animal dies, to say if we don't have those replacements available. And so that's really why I'm going to put forward this idea that, in fact, it's a push decision, not a pull decision that happens when it comes to culling and herd longevity. And I think to put this in perspective, nature can give us a really good example of what average herd longevity can look like. Now let's take an example of this little flock or this herd of geese that we see here. You can see in this picture, 5 animals within this herd, but what I've actually proposed is that this female goose, she actually laid 5 eggs this year. So the first question I have for all of you is, if this flock size is maintained, this flock size of 6 is maintained, how many goslings actually survive their first year? And I'll have Daniela pull up our first poll question now, because you all can't get away without audience participation today.
Yep, so I'm launching it right now. How many goslings survive 1 year? Yeah, please select your preferred choice. So right now we have about 50% of our participants answers.
We'll give the rest of you a few more seconds to find your mouse and your clickers.
Yeah.
All right, Daniela, what do we have?
Okay, so the results, are you seeing the results?
Yes, I see the results. I hope everyone does too, but I'll read them. So we have about 10% of people guessing that 1 gosling is surviving a year. 37% are guessing that 2 goslings survive a year. Then 27% think 3 survive, 18% think 4 survive, and 8% think 5 survive. Perfect. Thanks, Daniela. So actually, if we think about this being the herd flock sizes being maintained, we could have 1 gosling chick, if you will, survive a year, but probably not more than that, right? Because the herd size has to be maintained. And our herd size actually started off with 1 adult animal. That being said, what does this make the average lifespan of a goose? I'll have Daniela launch the next question.
It should be on.
Yep. The answer choices are 2 months, 3 months, and 5 months.
Okay, so now we have 50% of our participants that have answered that question.
All right. Okay, we can call it good. Thanks, Daniela.
Okay. Let me know if you see them.
Okay, so we have the average lifespan of a gosling is 18% chose 2 months, 31% chose 3 months, and 51% chose 5 months. Thanks, Daniela. So actually, this is just arithmetic. If we had 6 animals in the herd to begin with, well, we had 1 animal, she was an adult, she laid 5 eggs. And then at the end of a year, we have the same herd size, which is just 1 animal. The average lifespan is actually 2 months. And I think this is really important for us to understand, because what it does is it illustrates how important the number of young stock is in the average lifespan of an animal, and how, when we talk about herd longevity, it's actually not how long that individual adult lives or an individual gosling lives, but it's the whole group altogether. All right, so if we can agree on that, and then if we think about how in a herd, there are only so many spots that we have, right? we could either milk 100 cows if that's what can fit through our parlor and that's how many spots we have, or we could milk 1,000, we could milk 10,000, whatever that magic number is. But if you're a herd that's prepared to milk and has the capacity to milk 100, you're not going to milk 150 in the same spot. So we have a finite number of those spots. And in these spots, we want the healthiest, most productive animals. I think we can all agree upon that. But I think in these conversations about longevity, it's really easy for us to get impassioned about whether, like, what is the driving factor? Is the driving factor how good our welfare is? Is the driving factor how many replacements we have? Do we need to do a better job in X, Y, or Z? And I think that what I'd like to sort of baseline all of this with is that we shouldn't break our cows. If we're looking for the healthiest, most productive animals to be in our herd, the first thing we have to do is not break them. And if we think about that, and then we can talk about all of our decisions after that, we can all be aligned that it's not actually, we're not talking about the goal of breaking more animals. We're just trying to talk about the best way to execute with what we have. So historically, we've seen high and sort of trending higher rates of replacement rates in North America. I know this graphic can be a little bit challenging to see because there's a lot of bars on here, but the US is this little blue, it's this little blue bar here that you see. And you can see that we sort of stayed a little bit steady, went a little bit up, and then came back down in the early 2000s. This data doesn't actually go, in this graphic, doesn't actually go beyond 2010. But I do have these two data points here from another study as well. And then you can see that Canada, which is our gray bar here, has been sort of tightening up, but also trending down in sort of how many lactations or what the productive lifespan is in years of an animal on a herd. But you can see that we're probably not alone in this, and it does fluctuate. In 2007, we had an average US herd replacement rate of 33.4% or 33.7%, if I could read my slides. And in 2017, that actually increased. So it became almost 37% or 36.9%. Now, I think everyone has been watching the news lately, and we all know that this number has actually decreased this year because of a lack of heifers. And so if we think about all of this in context, what we're actually talking about is that we did a better job breeding heifers, keeping heifer calves alive. And so then we made more of these replacement decisions, and we turned over our herd faster. Now, I also know some people like to point out a sort of correlation between the milk per cow and the average number of lactations that we see. And this milk production is probably not a really great number to show you guys, but it is in 1,000 kilograms per cow per year, because then I could put it all on the same axis. But what you can see here in the green is that milk production per cow. And you can see the US on the bottom with the most milk produced per cow per year. And you can see in the blue that average number of lactations in the US is also at the bottom here with about 2.7 lactations per cow. Some people like to draw correlations between this, and I think that's something that we could do. But I also think there's a lot of management decisions that happen that maybe drawing a direct correlation between these two time points isn't always the best idea. So now for the final question for you guys. True or false? A cow must stay in the lactating herd approximately 2 years to pay for herself.
Okay, I just launched the poll, so please answer that question. We have 50% of participants now, Kaitlyn, so you let me know.
True, false questions are always a little bit faster. All right, I think we'll close it, Daniela. Thank you.
Okay.
And see the results. All right, we have 78% of people saying true and 22% saying false. Awesome. Thanks, Daniela. All right, well, that was a trick question, you guys. You should probably have gathered that from me by now. The answer is actually false. And that's only because of the trickery that I just did. And that is that she doesn't pay for herself, right? Her costs were 2 years ago when she was a heifer calf, and somebody else paid for her. We consider those sunk costs when we're talking about this from an economic perspective, but it's actually her job to pay for the current heifers. Now, some of you are probably wrinkling your brows or frowning at me, because I think this is what you think of when you think of the fact that that should be true. And that's it, the revenue from those 2 years of milk production minus her feed costs. That's what we can use to pay for the average cost of raising a heifer from birth to calving. But my challenge here is that it's not quite that simple, because when we think about which cows are making it to their second lactation and then finishing their second lactation, these are only the best cows of the herd, right? Say we had 300 heifers enter a herd. Not all 300 of them made it to calving. Certainly not all 300 of them make it through their first lactation. And definitely not all 300 of those would make it all the way through their second lactation. So we have to take into this fact that there's something called selection bias happening. And selection bias is the same concept as survivor bias, which is that only those best animals are the ones that we decide to keep. So she has to make milk, get pregnant, stay healthy. Otherwise, she's not going to make it on to the next lactation. And to put that into perspective, a little example would be, say we have 100 heifers calving in 2025. Probably 80 or so of those might make it all the way to their second lactation because they made enough milk, they got pregnant, and they stayed healthy. Maybe 20 or so of them might actually leave the herd in that first lactation. The US average is something around 16.8%. So my 80 for rounding purposes is pretty close. And then when we think about 80 of those calving in again as second lactation animals, only about 50 of them will actually make it all the way to their third lactation. Because again, they have to make enough milk, they have to get pregnant, and they have to stay healthy in order to do so. And so how does selection bias, or these best animals surviving, actually influence our perspective on longevity? What we see is that when we think about cow longevity, we see these older cows outperforming the younger cows when we think about milk production per head. I know you guys are all familiar with these dairy comp snapshots, but it's very obvious here that the first lactation animals are making less milk basically every day of the lactation than their second and third lactation counterparts. So what we see with that is we might think to ourselves, well, she'll make more milk when she enters her next lactation. Let's keep her around, which is a fine concept because she probably will make more milk. She'll be more mature. We tend to see that. But what we also have to remember is that we're comparing her to the best animals who are first lactation animals that made it onto their second lactation. So if we think about this from a herd longevity perspective, we think to ourselves, oh, actually, let's have a herd of older cows because they might make up more milk. But again, we have to remember that we've only kept the best older cows. Those older cows that got pregnant easily, they were healthy, and they made the most milk. We haven't actually forced all of our cows to stay longer, and even if they were sick, even if they didn't make as much milk. So we've really selected for the group of the very best oldest cows. Now, let's think about this again from our perspective of longevity when we think about welfare. So here we have an eGraph printout of mastitis events. And you can see here that we see way more green on the chart than we see blue and red, which makes sense when it comes to mastitis in particular. So if we think about cow longevity, these older cows have more health events than the younger animals do in the herd. Does that mean she has better welfare as an older cow? If our only welfare outcome is health events, then I think the answer would be no if we look at this. If we think about herd longevity, and we think about, is it better to turn over the herd faster or turn over the herd slower? Some might say that if we cull animals before they become problematic, that might actually be better for our welfare, right? So cull an animal before she becomes lame. Cull her before she gets too old and has a higher risk of mastitis. But if we think about those things, then we would say better welfare might exist with shorter longevity. Now, a few people did a little model on this, and it was presented at AVP a couple of years ago. And I will admit I was one of the few people, but don't worry, I promise not to be biased. And we did a really simple calculation here. We said, now what happens if we increase herd longevity, but we haven't changed management? We kept status quo management. We created a 1 cow model to investigate what happens to the environmental and cash flow, so environment and economics. And we just did some really simple math, so don't judge the numbers too much. But we said, oh, we'll have one herd and we'll call it 3340, which is a herd with a 33% replacement rate, making 40 kilograms of milk, or 88 pounds. Then we'll have a second herd and we'll call it 2030, which is 20% replacement rate and 30 kilograms of milk, or 66 pounds. Now, the only reason these two numbers were chosen was because we were looking to do this for 15 years. And as you guys know, 15 divides pretty easily by 5 and by 3. So if we think about this herd, what we've actually done is we've said in herd 3340, we had 88 pounds of cow, and over a 15-year time period, we sold 4 cull cows for beef. We sold 10 beef on dairy calves, and we raised 5 heifers. I'll go back to the diagram to point this out a little bit more. So here's 3340. Each of these pink stars is a heifer that we raised so that she could come 2 years later into lactation. And each of the blue stars is a beef on dairy calf that we sold. And then in herd 2030, they made 66 pounds of cow. We had 2 cull cows for beef, and then 12 beef on dairy calves, and we raised 3 dairy heifers. Here are some of the inputs that we had into our model, which are some dry cow and lactating cow feed costs, the differentiation in the cost of semen, a milk price of $20 a hundredweight, and then we assumed that everyone had the same feed efficiency, and they made 22.6 grams of methane per kilogram of dry matter intake. And what did we see? Well, what we saw was herd 2030, or the herd with a lower replacement rate, making less milk, because again, this was status quo management. So what we did was we just kept cows around longer, whether or not they got sick, whether or not they were lame, because we didn't improve any of that. We just made a replacement rate decision. What we actually saw was we had about 1,000 fewer hundredweights of milk shipped, 10,000 fewer 3-ounce servings of beef. So that's the reduction in the number of cull cows primarily that we saw, and $134,000 less in marginal cash flow, which is about $9,000 a year. We did produce a total of 1,000 pounds less enteric methane, but when we think about that in an enteric methane per unit of milk perspective, it actually ended up in a higher enteric methane intensity in that herd with a lower replacement rate. This primarily happened because we were making less milk, so we had less milk to divide the total footprint by. And the important point here is that this is because heifers are less costly from an environmental and an economic perspective than cows. Certainly from an environmental perspective, they are not creating as much enteric methane. The baby calves that aren't even full ruminants yet basically make no methane. And then those smaller heifers, as they grow, they make more and more methane, but certainly not as much as a big, old lactating cow. When we did a break-even analysis and we said, now we chose 88 pounds and 66 pounds, but you could be a lot closer than that, right? Status quo management could potentially, you could make the same amount of milk. Potentially you could make just a pound or 2 less. What does that actually look like? So when we did that for marginal cash flow, we saw that herd 2030, or the herd with the lower replacement rate, needed to make 84 pounds of milk to break even with herd 3340. So that was 84 pounds that the lower replacement rate herd had to make in order to have the same marginal cash flow as the 88 pound herd. And then we thought about enteric methane intensity, they had to make 74 pounds of milk in order to have the same break even. Now, I think this is important because it puts into perspective the importance of, if we reduce that replacement rate because we've chosen to raise fewer heifers, or it's a goal of ours to do, we have to change our management. We can't just expect everything to remain the same and perform equally as well as it was. Of course, on the welfare side, when we think about how status quo management and increased longevity can happen, we likely would see more lameness, more mastitis, and probably some skinnier cows on the beef truck. I'd like all of you to reflect a little bit on whether or not any of this has happened on your herd this past year. When we've had a shortage nationally of heifers, it might not impact you, but as we've thought about the whole US dairy herd on a whole, we actually have seen skinnier cows on the beef truck showing up at our beef plants. And probably a little bit more mastitis and a little bit more lameness. But what we've certainly seen is not the same milk production growth that we've seen in the past. And to put that into perspective here, if management doesn't change, we won't see that production improvement. We all know we've had low heifer numbers, and we've had certainly outbreaks of H5N1 across the country. And so it certainly takes time for our management, our improved management, to sort of catch up with this situation. And while this diagram is only through August, you can see that every month, the 2024 milk was actually below last year's milk production. And so while our largest outbreak of H5N1 hadn't happened yet in this graphic, we were still in that situation where we had less milk being produced overall in the US dairy herd. Now, what they're saying now is that overall we had a 0.4% increase in milk production. But if we think about that compared to where we've been in past years, this is really low. And I would argue that if we'd had enough heifers, we probably would have seen much more growth, especially given the milk price that we had this year and the feed costs that we have this year. And so here's the next point, and that is that if herd management improves, increasing longevity actually probably is beneficial. We can see improved energy-corrected milk, or that total milk production. We can see a lower reduction of disease and improved reproductive efficiency. We can do all of those things and see longer longevity or prolonged productive lives, but we have to manage that well. And so another study that I was part of was that we actually modeled this. We took a Wisconsin dairy farm and we used genetic merit as the difference between these cows. We said, how are the lower 25% of the herd performing compared to the higher 25% of the herd? And what happens if each of those makes their own herd? Now, I recognize that it is not actually the fact that you can take the lower 25% of a herd and create a whole another farm from that. Because that lower 25% of the herd does have pressure on it from that high 25%. But bear with me on this a little bit. And so we did that, and we were really trying to compare those differences in genetic merit and what the impact would be across dairy farms, because we certainly see farms that have lower genetic merit and farms that have higher genetic merit. And what we saw was that there was an 8% reduction in enteric methane intensity due to those herd improvements and improved longevity. So the higher DWP herd actually made about 10 pounds more milk a day, which was 11% more energy-corrected milk. We had a 3 percentage point increase in conception risk. So for cows, that was going from 42% overall to 45% overall. And in heifers, it was also a 3 percentage point increase, going from 56% to 59%. We saw a 25% decrease in the herd turnover rate. So the lower genetic merit herd had a 35% turnover, and the higher genetic merit herd had a 26% turnover. And I will say these are only the lactating animals that were modeled here, or that these numbers come from, I guess is what I should say. And then a 35% reduction in that death rate. 35% looks like a really big number, so I thought I would put into perspective what the actual death rates were, and that was 3.1% compared to the 2%. I think all of this is interesting for us to think about, right? Because what we did was the base herd, this was that all this data came from, all of the animals were under the same management conditions. So the only difference was that the higher genetic animals made more milk, they got pregnant more readily, and therefore they had fewer health events, and therefore they were culled less. Now, of course, that put pressure on that lower herd. So We can take some of these with a grain of salt, but it's still a pretty dramatic difference. Since I'm only showing you one herd here, but this has been recreated across 11 herds across the US, and these findings have remained. And my point here is that longevity and herd turnover rate are outcomes that have a lot of lag, and we actually shouldn't manage to longevity or herd turnover rate. We shouldn't say, oh, my goal is to go from 38% turnover to 35% turnover, because we can do that. What we need to do is we need to say, I care about welfare, so I should measure welfare. I'll measure lameness, I'll measure hawk scores, I'll measure any of these things that tell me about cow welfare. If I care about health, we should measure health, rate of mastitis, rate of lameness, whatever those things are. If we care about milk production, measure milk production. And if you care about profit, which hopefully you do, this is a business, measure your profit. But herd turnover rate or longevity are impacted by all of these things at such a rate that we shouldn't make the actual outcome of interest be longevity or herd turnover rate. We should work on the movable metrics before we actually get to total turnover rate. And I know this because dairy farmers can and will manage to that outcome, whatever it is that they're trying to target. So if we say, let's go from 38 to 35%, we can do that, but we might, if we haven't changed our management and we haven't changed cow comfort, for example, or our feeding strategy or our heifer rearing strategy, we probably won't be successful with that. If all we do is say, let's stop culling cows, what we'll see is less milk production. We'll see probably more lameness. We'll see more mastitis. We might see sick calves, whatever those things are. What we actually need to do is we need to say, yes, my long-term goal might be improved longevity, but what are the things that I can change today in my management to achieve that longer term? And with that, I've finished plenty early so we can have a robust discussion, but I will take any questions. Or if you don't feel like asking them here, you can email me.
Great. Thank you so much, Kaitlyn, for these excellent presentations. Please feel free to put any Q&A in the box of Q&A. Kaitlyn, I do have a question for you. Do you have what are some of the useful metrics that you would like to measure, or that you would like to first draw your attention to instead of focusing on the herd longevity or in just that rate, start, you mentioned welfare, you measure lameness, but do you have any specific metrics that that are like your go-to?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Daniela. And I think it depends a little bit on like what the opportunity on the individual farm is, right? So for example, I think if you've had a farm evaluation recently, or your vet has come recently and sort of pointed something out, those are good places to start. But I think also if you walk around with a critical eye and you think, maybe my mastitis is kind of high, but you're not actually doing a good job recording it, or there is some lag there, I think that's a really important place that we could start. Because right now, the other trouble is that there's probably more variation in how well we record disease events on dairy farms than there actually is in disease events on dairy farms. And so my first action would be, let's do a better job recording some of those. Yes. And let's step back, bring somebody on your farm who hasn't been on your farm before. And they might, for example, be another dairy farmer. They could help you figure out what some of those metrics could be. I know from personal experience, it was really eye-opening when one of my clients came to a dairy farm Blake and I were at, and this client dairies in the Fell, Michigan, where they have lovely deep-bedded sand-free stalls, and we were on mattresses. And the wife of the dairy farmer said to me, "Oh my gosh, what are those things?" And she was standing in the parlor, right? And she was pointing out a hock lesion. And never before in my life had I felt so bad about hock lesions on dairy cows as I did in that moment, right? Someone that knows what happens on a dairy farm, but pointed out a hock lesion to me, having not really seen them before because of the style of management that they have. And I think things like that are really important for us to have a critical eye to and to think about as ways we can improve our farms before we get to a longevity type conversation. So I didn't answer your question, Daniela.
Yeah, no, certainly, certainly. We do have 2 questions right now. So could you further explain the sink cost idea when talking about heifers needing to make it to 2 lactations before they pay for themselves? If you could have some clarification comments on that.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it is confusing. So the concept of a sunk cost is that you have already paid for whatever it is. And I'll use a car as an example, right? You purchased a new car 3 years ago, you've paid it off, and now you show up for your yearly inspection, and they say, guess what? You can't pass inspection until you fix I don't know. I'm gonna come up with something weird that you guys are gonna laugh at. Clearly, I'm not a car mechanic, but like, no, you have to fix this piece of whatever on your muffler in order to pass the inspection. Your choice then is to say, well, I could buy a new car, right? Or actually, I've already paid for this car. I'm just going to pay for what I have to pay for today. And that's the concept of sunk costs, right? So if a cow is already lactating, we have already invested, if she's an average animal, $2,000, $2,500 in her showing up. And that has already been paid for. So today we have to make a decision about her. And if she's really sick, if she isn't making very much milk, if she, I don't know, something tragic has happened and she broke her leg, just because you paid $2,500 to have her get to this point doesn't mean that she should stay in the herd going forward, right? Because she's actually not going to pay for herself. She's going to pay for whoever is out there still being raised. I hope that sort of answers it. It's the concept that, like, if she's already here and lactating, she's already made it that far, so she can't technically pay for her. She has to pay for somebody else. It's really just economic and financial jargon that I'm trying to throw at you, but it's important.
No, that's great. We have just another comment. So you would not look at productive life, but improve welfare and let the system increase longevity rather than genetics, or use both?
Yeah, that's a great one too. Yes, essentially I agree with that. I would say, let's improve the system. And then if increased productive life is what we end up with, like, that's great. But if it's, for some reason, it's not what we've ended up with because we've decided to expand the herd, or I don't know, maybe your first lactation animals are like, because of genetics, because of nutrition, they're all making 130 pounds and you don't need old cows. Like, that's fine too, if that's sort of where the cookie crumbles. But work on improving the management and let productive life be a longer term outcome rather than the goal that we manage to. Yep.
Yeah. Perfect. We have another one. If we are interested in moving towards better longevity in our herd, who would be able to help set up and review our systems or goals? And we also have a comment that says the questions and examples you presented were very helpful. So thanks. So yeah, who do you have any tip regarding who would be able to review the system or the goals?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'm pretty sure ProDairy and CCE have some people you could call. But I would also suggest asking your veterinarian or your nutritionist, depending on sort of who those advisors are on your farm, right? I would also say, if you're like really interested in having a bunch of students involved in said learning opportunity, pretty sure Cornell takes out all their fellow students to do things like this on their farms too. But yeah, reach out to your CCE and the ProDairy folks. They can help do those walkthroughs, identify some of those bottlenecks. Your vet, your nutritionist, I think those are probably the primary ones.
Yeah, and I
Call
do
me, but I
wanna
don't live close to you, probably.
I do want to give a shout out to our pro dairy specialist, Lindsay Forlito. She's the welfare and cow comfort, if I'm correct, specialist. She is farm certified and she can be a great resource as well. So we have another question. Recognizing that we need to consider improving longevity and near-term welfare and production metrics, how do you balance net replacement cost against an expected or planned cull rate?
Yeah. Um, so what I would say twofold here is that when we talk about replacement costs, um, we so often think about the average replacement. And it is important to think about that average replacement, that $2,200, $2,500, whatever it's costing your farm today to raise the average animal. I would say two things. One is that as long as you sort of have the space in your heifer system, raising a few extra or a few less does not equate to the same $2,200. Um, there's there are variable costs and fixed costs in heifer raising, and variable costs are things like feed and semen being used. And so you could raise a few extra or a few less, and your average cost across all those animals probably won't change that much. But the additional, that incremental cost is also much smaller than the average cost. So I'd say that is the first thing. And that is that I wouldn't shy away from today. Like today, you're making a decision about what your herd is going to look like in 3 years. Wouldn't change that too much today, even if longer term you're looking to have an improved longevity through better welfare, through better health, whatever that might be. I wouldn't cut back on my number of replacements today until you sort of felt comfortable that your management had achieved that so far. I would also say that having that additional marginal or like an extra heifer to freshen in, you can, while you have paid for her raising costs, certainly today, you could sell her as a fresh heifer for buku bucks. I think I just saw that in Minnesota they had heifers going springers going for $4,200. So I know those decisions were many years ago, right? That we made those decisions, but don't think it's going to change that fast in our industry. But I would say keep a little buffer there and really work on what those management changes look like in your adult animals and sort of in that heifer rearing process, such that your overall cull rate can change. So maybe that's putting in like if lameness is a challenge, like regrooving your concrete, right? Or putting in some rubber, or setting up more frequent or more routine, maybe hoof trimming on your farm. Like work through those pieces, see how it reduces your lameness and how the cows fare with that. And then as those heifers come in, you can choose to make a decision about an individual animal at that point, but don't let a heifer freshening in force you to make a decision unless you really need to, unless a cow should really go, right? Things like cow val or relative value, or sort of like waiting until she's a fresh heifer might be like third test day in, or about 60 to 90 days in milk, and making a decision at that point will really sort of help you pick the right animals in your herd. I hope I answered that question in a useful way. If not,
Thank
we
you.
can
And we also had a related comment of facilities, that we need to spend more time promoting improving facilities and management so cows don't become lame. So yeah, thank you. We do have another interesting question. How do you use genetic testing to help you with longevity and sustainability measures in your culling decision making?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think this part of genomics and genetics are accelerating really rapidly. So, what I'll say is that today we have the ability to, within the net merit index, within DWP, within whatever index it is that you use, productive life, the risk of different diseases, and reproductive, like daughter pregnancy rate or heifer conception rate. Both of those, all of those are sort of built into those indexes. And you can use those to pick animals or talk to your semen sales rep to pick animals that are, if you're feeling good, I guess I'll say basically every bull out there makes more milk, right? Or higher components. You don't really find many of those that aren't doing that, because that's sort of our goal as dairy farmers. So from there, you can start to pick more of those animals with some of those higher health or repro related traits. And we actually do have good data to say that there is a genetic component to disease, for example, risk of lameness, whatever those outcomes might be. So I'd suggest that. The second piece I'll say is that I think this will come in, I hope, 2025, but I guess I don't really know the timeline. But there has been a lot of data that's been collected over the past year on individual cow enteric methane. So that's the methane that she creates when she burps, right? After a rumination. We're never going to get rid of enteric methane from cows, because otherwise they won't be cows. But this cow, 1485, and the next cow, 1514, say they make the same amount of milk, but one of them does it in making less methane. And we have the ability, well, we have the data. It's not yet put in an index, but I think it will be soon, to actually pick more of the 1485s, because she makes the same amount of milk, she's just as healthy, and she makes less methane compared to 1514. So that'll be, keep your eye out. I don't know when it'll come out, but I do know a whole bunch of that data has been collected, and some of it was presented last year at ADSA. So I have high hopes that it'll come out really soon. But that's a true sustainability metric. And I think that companies, I won't speak for, I guess I can't say for sure that Fairlife will do this, but companies such as Fairlife will help to incentivize choosing some of those animals, right? Animals that are healthier, that will have lower enteric methane, that make just as much milk, because that's our goal as an industry, right? To produce sustainable milk with healthy, productive cows.
Great. We'll be on the lookout.
Yeah, be on the lookout.
Yeah. We do have another good question. Is there a way to compare older cow production versus first lactation cows without the bias of survivor selection, the one that you explained?
Yeah, that's no. The short answer to that is no. Because believe it or not, we can't convince dairy farmers to just keep every single animal forever and ever. I'm kidding, sort of. The true answer is no, just because I think it'll have to be a research dairy that does this study, right? If we're truly that interested in it as a dairy industry, because or we'd have to pay individual dairy farmers a lot to just keep every cow around, right? Or through the second lactation or something like that, because all of our data has only been based on who makes it to the next lactation because of who they were as an individual. So it actually makes it really hard, because like if you're looking at a heifer and a second lactation animal, for example, and you're trying to make a decision about like who should get on the beef truck today, and you pick out something like ME305 or M305, either one of those, they correct everyone to look like a third lactation animal, but the best third lactation animal, right? So we sort of overcompensate when we're trying to make these decisions, and it makes it really challenging.
Thank you. Thank you for your great presentation. Thanks everyone for being here, and we'll see you next week.